There were really only three original STANIER designs. The most famous is undoubtedly the mixed-traffic Black 5. This two-cylinder 460 design was to become the epitome of the LMS, as it was one of the most truly all-purpose types of locomotive in the history of Britain's railways. At home on express passenger trains, as well as mixed freights, 842 were to be built, together with the scarcely altered 172 British Railways examples. 472 of these were built in the 30s, and they were soon to be seen on all parts of the LMS system, the most notable engines of the scrap and build philosophy. STANIER's first design was the LMS's first Pacific type. Two prototypes were built in 1933, and they were followed by a production batch of 10 2 years later. The objective was to produce a locomotive capable of through running from London to Glasgow. The Scots had to be changed at Carlisle, their narrow fireboxes requiring cleaning by then. The Princesses, with their wide fireboxes, could go considerably further before the fire became choked. Like the Jubilees, they experienced teething troubles, but the application of high superheating cured this, and they took over the prestige work in the middle years of our decade. The scrap and build policy was to extend to all parts of the LMS system, and to all types of locomotives. However, it was apparent that the former LNWR classes were to see the most rapid replacement. The LNWR's locomotive policy, satisfactory types being allowed to run basically unaltered, was different from that of the Midland Railway, where locomotives were constantly rebuilt to current specifications. Replacement of Midland types was not so noticeable, as that railway's dominance in locomotive matters in the 1920s had meant that the LMS continued to build Midland types. Even replacements for LNWR engines were of Midland appearance. No small tank engines were built in the 1920s, the LNWR 242s and Midland 044s being sufficient for local duties. However, by the end of the decade, the oldest ones were very old, and some replacements were needed. Derby Drawing Office came up with a series of Class 3P 262 tanks, 70 of which were built from 1930 to 1932. STANIER altered the design by substituting his own boiler, and built another 170 of them, the variety seen here, from 1935 to 1938. Both varieties of 3P were very feeble, unlike the slightly larger 4P 264 tanks, first produced by Fowler in 1927, which is seen next. These had their origins in a study under Hughes, and were effectively based on his highly successful crabs. The smaller 3Ps were a totally separate design, in the true Midland tradition, and suffered accordingly. The Fowler 264s were continued under STANIER, the last batch having a modified cab, until there were 125 examples by 1934, 50 of which were built in the 1930s. Their main duties were on London suburban services. As always, STANIER changed the design only by the substitution of his own taper boilers. 86 were built in the 30s, and they were as successful as the earlier machines. On the freight side, the picture was similar. The LNWR Super D080s were the best of the inherited stock, and the earlier classes continued to be updated to the final design. However, they weren't really suitable for the faster freight services, for which the Hughes-designed crabs had proved to be the best of the early LMS standard types. Building of the original design of crabs continued until 1932, by which time there were 245 of them, after which STANIER substituted his boiler and changed the layout of the cylinders and valve gear for new construction. The only modification to the original Hughes crabs was the fitment of Lenz rotary valve gear to 5 engines in 1931. Similarly, ACFI feed water gear fitted to the last 3 built was the only modification to the unsatisfactory 7F Austin 7s, of which another 75 were built in the 1930s. Here was a design that wouldn't be improved by the addition of a STANIER boiler, so the third totally new STANIER design was for heavy freight, the Class 8F 280, originally also designated Class 7F. They were an instant success, and production started in 1935. Although they were to become amongst the most numerous class of all time, the LMS only had 126 of them by the end of the decade. It's curious to note that the STANIER boilers on the Jubilees, Black 5s and the 8Fs were all unique to their classes, despite being very close in their dimensions, the antithesis of standardization in the churchwood sense.